Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Echoes of War. I'm Craig from the Pacific War Channel, joined here by my co-host Gaurav and our guest Simon. How are you?
Hey
Oh,
Craig,
nice to be
hey
here.
Simon.
Realized I
Thank you for
probably should
inviting
have
me again.
separated your names so you could say it not at the same time, but pleasure that you're both here. And well, I'll just say today's episode is going to be a pretty exciting one. It's the naval arms race, and for people who don't know about this, this is just before World War One, and it's between Britain and Germany. Although there actually is other nations to a lesser extent involved, kind of. But before we
Not
jump,
really important enough to say.
yeah, well, I mean, it's only the Japanese far exceeding both. But anyways, before we jump into it, if you'd like to further support the channel, please consider joining the YouTube channel membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to an exclusive podcast series. It's about 25 episodes and ongoing at this point. You get early access to all of my content and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. But stating all of that, I guess I'm going to hand it to you guys to kind of start us off in what is a rather crazy point in history that got out of hand pretty quickly because of
All
Wilhelm
right.
II, mind
I
you.
think uh you should just also mention for this episode in particular, we are gonna be sharing ship images,
Oh, yes.
ship designs. Audience members, we are gonna have a visual component. Do check it out on YouTube. It's gonna make a lot of sense when we are talking about like the gun placements, the looks of the guns, etc.
Yeah,
Definitely want to do
I have a
this.
full blueprint of the HMS Dreadnought. Kind of funny that it's named that as well as basically the shell sizes from the 18-inch all the way down to the 8 for armor piercing and high explosive. And we have other goodies of all the pictures of all the people we'll be talking about. And I'm sure we're gonna have a lot of ships in this one. So yeah, people, please check us out on YouTube.
Got it. All right. So let's probably go back in time to the around 1860s, 1870s. This time, the navies of the world are transitioning from the age of sail to the ironclad and steam-powered ships. You already saw a few ironclads fight in the American Civil War, and Britain and France are also, changing over their ships into steam power and such. So you at this time also we have these real straight hybrids as well, I would call them, of sailing ships with paddle steamers mixed together,
Oh yeah.
like just being propelled together.
1870s,
Any
a lot of those. They're very awkward to look at.
Indeed. Now, Britain naturally, as the preeminent empire of the world, needs a big navy. That's how it projects its power. And it's also why the Russian fleet in the Russo-Japanese War was unable to refuel because, oh, all the ports around the world were controlled by Britain. And that is actually very strategic of the Royal Navy. They maintain these ports at optimal ranges so that the ships would never be traveling more than with the absolute essential amount of fuel, which gave it combat effectiveness. But Britain, to project its power, needs to keep this large empire and its navy, because the navy is needed to safeguard it.
Might want to mention to the
And
audience that this is coal powered at this point, and it's tons and
yeah,
tons of coal that needs to be put onto the ships. It takes a long time. And yeah, Britain across the globe has coaling stations just about everywhere you could imagine, specifically in the Asia Pacific. Other nations like France and Germany, to a lesser
also,
extent, they have coaling stations, but not as strategic.
Yeah, and
and this is just a
it
sorry.
oftentimes depends a bit on the proximity to the colonies that these nations have. So they have to choose oftentimes specific routes so they can actually get the coal in.
And this is again an example picture of the Royal Navy in the early 20th century, just to kind of give you an idea of what this navy was.
Man, that is
The
a hell
most
of a
powerful,
picture.
that's the most powerful force on the planet, to say the least, this time. Now, at this time, there are two schools of thought. Britain is just continuing with the standard naval approach, I would call it, whereas France actually, which at this moment in the early 1870s is the second largest navy in the world. they kind of go for this school of thought or doctrine called the Jeune École.
Jeune d'école doctrine. Quand
Sorry,
tu parles
I
français, tu
apologize for
parles
that.
français vraiment bon, hein?
But the French believed in commerce trading, and it is a school of thought that ended up getting permeated throughout multiple other navies as well, though probably the effectiveness was questionable. So for about 10 to 12 years, France just did not build any big ships. They focused on smaller destroyers, torpedo boats, fast cruisers at the most, and the early submarines, which they felt was the key to crippling Britain and any navy for that matter as well. And the French also propagated a thinking which also found its way through most navies at this time, especially for their battleships, which was the tumble home design. Now, the tumble home is a ship design where the widest part of the ship is at the bow, right, at the waterline. Just give me a second. I have an image. Just makes it easy to visualize it. The widest part of the ship is at the waterline. So in theory, when an enemy wants to board, there's already a gap between the deck line and the the ships, because they'd have to extend quite a big plank over. And the idea was that this platform would reduce the weight of the superstructure on top and improve stability. Though also is worth pointing out that made maintenance of the guns, as you can see, they're kind of mounted a bit outside of the ship, pretty difficult, and these ships were hardly seaworthy. The British continue with the typical flare design, which is how you would just say, like, it rises up in width, as you can see here on the schematic of HMS.
I think we may have lost connection.
Yeah.
Oh, there we're back. Sorry.
Zoom, I guess.
Yeah, must have
Where
been.
did you guys lose me?
You're just talking about the how the ship design flares up.
Yeah. So nothing more to add. It's just a standard one. But what was important was the naval act that Britain passed, which was called the Two Power Standard in the Naval Defense Act of 1889, which designated that Britain has to keep an equal number of tonnage and capital ships that is greater than or equal to the next two navies combined, which at this point of time, when the act was passed, was the Imperial Russian Navy and the French Navy. Germany, on the other hand, had grand ambitions. It's a new empire. And Simon, maybe you would like to talk a little bit of the history of the German Navy, just from its inception days, as we build up to the turn of the century.
Yeah, so first of all, we have to understand that the German Navy, as you said, is really young because the German nation is extremely young. We have to keep in mind the formation of the German state only happened in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. So by unifying all of these countries that were former independent, most didn't have a navy, some did have, but were really small because, well, it's not cost effective for them. So pretty much only Prussia really had a navy before that. So they more or less took over their strategies, their ship design, and just created it bigger. And for a long period of time, the Navy didn't get as much attention. Part of this they got from Bismarck, not trying to not upset the British. But as Bismarck lost more and more power, especially when the new emperor, Emperor Wilhelm II, took over, who had these great ambitions for the German Empire, he had a completely different approach. So in his mind, Germany was the greatest power and everyone should bow down to them. Everybody else needs to give them more respect, which in some ways is understandable because the German Empire didn't have much of the privileges other empires had because it was so young. But on the other side, it completely shattered the status quo. Diplomacy really lost any semblance of what it was before.
Now, I think I'll just step in and just add that the preeminent power of ships, right? Like the status symbol. Today we will talk about, in today's navies, it's the aircraft carrier, right? You'll talk about the Nimitz class, the Ford class. I think now the UK, it's the Queen Elizabeth II class. And India, we have our own super carrier apparently being built. I think it's under construction already, but just laid down. Anyways, but until mid World War II, we know that many admirals and people still believed it was the battleship that was the king of the oceans. Now, at this time, the battleships that we know were not as large as what we see in World War II. They're literally a fraction of the size in comparison. And they have an assortment of guns, right? So they don't have a full heavy salvo or battery. They have guns that range in caliber from 12 inches, 11 inches, some even having 13 inches back in the 1890s. And they can go all the way down to machine gun levels, 1.5-inch guns. And as we saw in the, one moment, that French design ship, let me just bring back up the image. They're not all put in the turrets system that we're used to, like in pairs or threes, or like if you even go to the King George IV, the quadruples. You can see that these turrets, for example, are all single mounted. And in the schematic of Agamemnon, the two main guns, as you can see here in the bottom of the image, they are mounted on just a two twin turret configuration, and these represent the smaller caliber guns that are there. The idea was the battleship is supposed to be able to engage in the longest range of combat at the time, and also close range combat where these smaller caliber weapons will be useful, or if they're engaging like smaller torpedo boats, destroyers, and all, you don't want to always expend your ammunition. These big guns were reserved exclusively for heavy cruisers or above, since a 12-inch shell was the only shell that had the firepower to break through enemy armor and hit the engine rooms or the main batteries, like the ammo storages of other battleships. This heyday of this type of battleship, I think, Craig, there's a great battle or set of events that you've covered well in the Pacific War channel. I think maybe you'd like to share about the naval side of that battle.
Yeah, before I jump into the legendary Battle of Tsushima, uh, one of the greatest examples for kind of the evolutionary from, we call it pre-dreadnought to full dreadnought, and then later comes the battleship, was actually it was during the first Sino-Japanese War. So this was at the Battle of the Yalu River. And this is actually an interesting point in time because there was a lot of theories going around about how these ships would engage each other. So, for example, the British, like anybody else, assumed the bigger the gun, like the bigger like a 12-inch, versus an 8-inch, the longer the range, of course, and they would be fighting from extreme ranges. And then once they get closer, their secondaries would kick in. These are like the 4.7, 7-inch guns, and then you would just start battering each other. Well, what happened in practice was the Japanese quickly realized there was no battle at long range. It was almost useless, particularly against their opponent. The Chinese boasted two German-built pre-dreadnoughts, or actually kind of ironclads, to be honest, the Dingyuan and Jeyuan, and the Japanese had nothing size-wise that compared to this. The Japanese was one of the only navies that adopted the Jundeiko doctrine because they learned from France. They initially were actually learning from the Prussians. They went to the British and then they went to the French. So they went with building fast cruisers with rapid firing guns, which are smaller in caliber. But the Japanese had the foresight to realize that there was no fighting the enemy at the extreme distances that these large caliber cannons could achieve. While the Chinese were the opposite, they just started firing blindly at them at the start of the battle and they were just missing. The Japanese withheld their fire. They got within about 4,000 yards of range and then they used their quick firing guns and it was like a flawless victory almost. It was ridiculous how much they destroyed the Chinese fleet, the Beiyang fleet back in the day. Now, like you said, we turn the tables over to the Russo-Japanese War, and this is about 15 years in the future. This is like
I think
dreadnoughts.
I would just add one little thing.
Yeah,
The one of the biggest problems I think that the navies were also starting to worry about, which was in the interlude between the first Sino-Japanese War and Tsushima,
yeah.
was the introduction of torpedoes at scale.
Yeah, the torpedoes were used in the first Sino-Japanese War, but we're literally talking about ships, and I don't know how else to describe this, using like giant poles and prodding other ships with the explosive. It wasn't how we considered torpedoes. It was rudimentary. They didn't know how to use them. In the Russo-Japanese War, there was like, I would say they overly feared what the capabilities of the torpedo were. So, for example, Gav knows this well. The Russians mistakenly believed the Japanese were sneaking into the Atlantic to attack their fleet with like these ghost destroyers. And they ended up firing on some British fishermen thinking they were Japanese destroyers or submarines. There was a thought that there were submarines.
The great mighty Kamchatka engaging 8 destroyers
Yeah.
from a 360-degree vantage point in the North Sea.
Yeah. By the way, Japan didn't have submarines at this time. They wouldn't even really have a submarine program until like after World War One, when like the British gave them a bunch of like enemy subs and they learned from it. But anyways, yeah, the Russians were hilarious in the Russo-Japanese War. When it came down to the Russo-Japanese War, now you had a more comparable enemy compared to what the Chinese and the Japanese were looking at. So the Japanese were outgunned. The Russians had an incredibly large-sized fleet, but when they showed up to Tsushima, they had literally sailed across the entire world. They didn't have proper stations to get their coal. They were completely ill-maintained. Their sailors were drunk. Like, that's not me just like knocking on Russians. They actually were a bunch of drunks and they were demoralized when they showed up.
I would just add that it was said that a lot of I think that half the sailors were like, the worst pick of the Russian navies. That's why they were in the
Yeah,
Black Sea and the Baltic Sea fleets from where the Second Pacific
yeah.
Squadron was formed, or they were just literally plugged out of the ocean.
It wasn't like
I mean, for the
necessarily their fault. Like, yes, they were poorly trained, but that's because most of the year round they're icebound and they weren't training. The Japanese, on the other hand, they trained specifically with gunnery all year round. It was the difference level in training was ridiculous between these two fleets. You could argue the Russians had a much better fleet, better armaments and everything necessary to win, whereas the Japanese, they came into this just better trained, specifically in gunnery. And well, they're going to floor them at the Battle of Tsushima. The Russians basically fell for quite a simple trap. The Japanese got them exactly into an area that they wanted the Russians to come into. The Japanese had built their own, I'll call it radio technology. It's not what we conceive as radio technology. It's like a precursor to it. It's using telegrams. Whereas the Russians were,
Greg, I think that I'm just showing like a simple battle map.
yeah,
Is that visible?
yeah, it is.
Yep.
The Russians were using, I'll call it radio sets, German built radio sets that they didn't understand how to operate. And actually, I think even the books on how to operate them were in German, which is kind of funny. So the Russians didn't really understand how to use communication. So they were relying on like the old signals and the flag waving. Whereas the Japanese had a fully, by that point in time, one of the most modern radio sets that they built themselves. They had learned from the British, but they went through the trial and error of building their own technology. And I mean, to just brutally summarize, at Tsushima, it's one of the only times in naval history where the Japanese actually performed a proper crossing of the T and just devastated the Russian fleet. And I mean, the battle was over pretty quick. The Russians would fight these sporadic battles against just armada of Japanese destroyers that were acting like sharks going after them with torpedoes later. But the battleships versus battleships and the cruisers, it came down to just an absolute hellstorm when the Japanese finally crossed the T. And the Japanese did take a licking because it was a dramatic turn that they had to take into really hard Russian fire to manage to cross the T.
I think this was around this point here.
Yeah. Oh, and for the audience who's not seeing a diagram right now, the crossing of the T, basically, you have to picture it as instead of being parallel to your enemy, where your broadsides are both firing upon each other, one side manages to turn in front of the other side so that all of their broadsides are basically shooting upon what is an incoming column.
They
And
they are perpendicular to
exactly.
the line. So the idea was the Russians, as they're advancing north towards Port Arthur and Vladivostok, the
Yeah.
Japanese will be moving west to east or east to west. So the Russians can only fire with their forward batteries at the most from the leading ships,
Yep.
whereas the Japanese are able to turn their entire firepower on them at one go.
And just
One,
to give you another idea, at Tsushima, the firing started at about 14,000 yards. So if you compare that to the Battle of Yalu in 1894. I'm a little dyslexic there. That was like 4,000 yards. So the technology had increased, the proficiency in gunnery increased, but the Japanese were unbelievably better in shooting than the Russians. And they actually had this unique system of colored dye shells that helped their gunners kind of see where the splashes were better than the Russians. So the Russians were just outgunned. And the closer the two forces got, the smaller caliber Japanese guns were, they overwhelmed them. But yeah.
I think I remember reading this report because there were a few British naval attaches
No, there's
who
many.
were present on the Japanese fleet at this moment during the battle. Their
Yep.
reports were studied quite extensively, especially by the Royal Navy. And it said at the start of the battle, the Russians' big gun accuracy was pretty commendable.
Yeah,
They
I'm
were
sure it
pretty
was.
much it was only at the big gun. So we're talking about like, anything north of the 10 and 11-inch shells. It was having a similar accuracy percentage to what the Japanese were landing as well. And it is, as you said, when they got closer
Yeah.
and, control breaks down and there is pandemonium, it's discipline, and the Japanese had the more robust firing systems, which allowed them to overwhelm the Russians in a decisive victory. And I think it's just pretty cool that we still have the oldest battleship in service still, the
Yep.
Mikasa, the
Yeah.
flagship of the Japanese fleet here.
And lesser known fact, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was a young off. Well, actually, I don't even know if he was an officer at the time. He was aboard one of the ships at the battle. He actually
Oh,
lost
damn.
a few fingers during it.
I guess that's one thing he has in common with Nimitz.
Yeah.
But I think this shows that why the British were planning to change. Now, we have our great British First Lord of the Sea, Jackie Fisher. Craig, maybe you'd like to talk about Jackie Fisher and his ideas, right, as a proponent of change.
Yeah, and I will just mention to the audience, I took very short notes because there's a lot of figures we're going to be talking about, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet as much as I can. But Admiral Sir John Jackie Fisher was a distinguished British naval officer, and he was an influential reformer known for modernizing the Royal Navy in the early 20th century. Joined the Navy in 1854. Man, think about that. It's really young. He quickly advanced through the ranks, becoming known for his innovative ideas on naval strategy and technology. And we're talking about a time when this is like the most rapid changes I think the Navy's seen in what, a millennia. It's pretty crazy. The turn of the 20th century, it's nuts.
I
But
think this would be the biggest set of changes, like at pace, since probably the introduction of the galleons,
yeah,
so that deep sea vessels actually became a thing.
yeah, exactly. And he would be appointed First Sea Lord in 1904, and he would champion the development of the Dreadnought class. You can call them battleships, but we'll we should call them just dreadnoughts at this point, and he advocated for the use of multiple different types of technology, including submarines and naval aviation. Fundamentally, he transformed naval warfare, not just for Britain, but for the world in many ways. His tenure was marked by bold initiatives, but also controversies. Particularly, he clashed with a lot of the traditionalists within the Navy, which is typical of the Navy. It's one of those it's one of those structures where you're always butting heads with the old dogs, you know? His emphasis on speed, efficiency, and modernization significantly improved Britain's naval capabilities leading up to the First World War. And I don't know how much you want me to go into this, but he will end up having to.
That's
Yeah.
yeah, I think we can maybe leave his little World War One career for then
Yeah.
because guy's old man. By now he's been serving in the Royal Navy for 50 years.
It's a hell of a career. Yeah.
And not to mention, he actually clashed a lot with King Edward VII, the reigning monarch, when he took over as First Sea Lord.
Yeah.
And let me just bring up some sharing.
By the way, I have to ask, are you
Yeah,
guys hearing my parrots? They're screaming like crazy right now.
not really yet.
Okay,
Not
thank
yet.
God. All right. Because I keep muting myself. Okay.
All right, so this is our good old friend Jackie Fisher. And he was also a big proponent of being ruthless and efficient in the Navy. So ships cost a lot of money. He scrapped almost 100 vessels from active frontline service when he took over as the First Sea Lord. Most of them were completely sold for scrap. About 40, 50 more vessels were put on the reserve. He also professionalized training for engineers and all, which the engineer corps of the Royal Navy actually, when he took over as a second Sea Lord, so it was just a few years before taking over as First Sea Lord, but he changed the personnel. He started promoting people from this class because they were going to be very relevant for the new generation of warships that are coming over. Now, as you mentioned, Craig, Fisher wanted an all big gun battleship because there's no point having secondary armament for short distance combat when, as we saw in the Battle of Tsushima, the Russians and Japanese were successfully dueling, with hits being recorded at the ranges of over 14,000 yards. And the torpedoes are going to be coming in now. So there is that extra fear. So his ideas, why, and this is quoting Simon, you don't need to get into close range combat. We don't need the small guns when you can just blow them away from distance. That was pretty much it. And he optimized the engines quite a bit. So the propulsion was increased. So this was like the start of what you could call like, the fast sailing battleships. Because the battleships were relatively slower. I'll get into some details of some comparisons soon. And this was the brainchild of his, the HMS Dreadnought, which, might I add, was actually not fully sanctioned from the get-go by the top brass of the Royal Navy. It was a secret project that he launched. But it still amazes me that you've had this one ship when it just launched into service. It just made every other battleship in the world obsolete. And keep in mind, battleships cost a lot of money to build out. And he did, however, have some patronage from the kings of England. So initially Edward the Seventh and later King George V, because both also did serve in the Royal Navy, though he did butt heads with the king because he wanted to use the Royal Navy in about 1908, 1909 in a decisive attack on Germany to neutralize the threat quite early. Now, I think it would be better to first maybe talk about how it differed in comparison to the previous ships, because without that, it's just a bit difficult. Now, I've made a comparison of various pre-dreadnought ship classes of the battleship, the preceding class before dreadnought. So for the United Kingdom, it was the Lord Nelson class. France was the Liberté class. Russia was the Andrei Perzani class, and Germany was the Deutschland class. Now, all of them had guns all over the place, plain and simple. So I think the displacement was ranging between 13,200 tons of the Deutschland class up to 17,000 tons for the Russians. The British and French were both around 15,500-ish. They were all similar in length, between 128 to 140 meters, about a 22 to 24 meter beam, and 9 meters draught. Now, this is something I just find crazy, is the British Lord Nelson class. It had the least amount of horsepower generation capacity as any of the other countries' pre-dreadnoughts. It could generate 16,750 horsepower, which is lesser than the Deutschland class, which could generate slightly more. The French and Russian Navy ships of the Liberté and the André class, they could generate 2,000 horsepower more. So it's quite a big propulsion change. But this is where it's kind of interesting and showing how the Royal Navy's prowess is there, right, in designing very optimal ships. The range of Britain's Lord Nelson was 70,000 kilometers. The French had about 15,500. The German Deutschland class, not that much, 9,000 kilometers. The Russians, on the other hand, oh boy, 4,400 kilometer range. And this is at a speed of about 10 knots. So that is a cruising speed of 19 kilometers an hour. And now this is going to give you an idea of how split up the batteries were. The British Lord Nelson had 4 12-inch guns, a total of 10 9.2-inch guns, 24 3-inch guns, and 12 2-inch guns with 5 torpedo tubes. The Deutschland class had 4 11-inch guns, 14 6.7-inch guns, 22 3.5 guns, and quite a lot of them would be arranged in single turrets as well. They're not going to be working as we see later in, like, for example, World War II, where you have like triple turrets, double turrets, etc. Now, if we compare this to what HMS Dreadnought was, it also gives you an idea of why it kind of changed the complexion, because Dreadnought on its launch was about 18,120 tons. It's a good 20-25% more in displacement. It's 160 meters long. So it's gone up quite a bit. Similar, slightly wider. And when I said the British had about 16,750 horsepower in their Lord Nelson, the previous class, the Dreadnought moved up to 23,000 horsepower. While it sacrificed range, having a range of 12,000 kilometers, its top speed went up from 18 knots to 21 knots. And the biggest change was obviously the weapons. It had 5 12-inch guns mounted in dual turrets and 27 3-inch guns and torpedoes. It also had significantly more armor at its belt and around the conning tower and battery in comparison to its predecessor. So that was the big change, and I have a few schematics. Yeah. So as you can see, this was the schematic of Dreadnought. So we can see that it had a lot of frontal firepower with the sides, but the turrets are going to be linked. So they're not going to be firing slow turrets. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, a lot of the single turrets will not be, there's no easy coordination. They are slow to reload. The shells would have to come from different ammo places. So it was required a lot of effort to transport them around the hold. Now here you're able to test better fire control systems. and you're able to fire a salvo of like 6 to 8, 10 and 12-inch shells. That's going to be quite scary. Yeah, so I think I'll just stop there now. I think we should talk about the German response, because while we did allude to Kaiser Wilhelm, I think Admiral Tirpitz is the real, genius, you want to use the term, for the growth of the German Navy. Simon, maybe you have something to share about how Tirpitz came about and what was his plans.
Yes, so yeah, I wouldn't call Tirpitz a genius. He's more like the ambition behind the project. So to understand him, he has the position of the Staatssekretär des Reichsmarineamtes, which is like the top guy of the Navy. And he got this position in 1897. And he once said that, Wilhelm II once said that, and he reiterated it, that Germany's future is on the seas. That's a quote from the Kaiser. And the Kaiser, to essentially reaffirm this and to get the strategy done, employed Admiral Tirpitz. Now, this guy, he just aggressively pushed for the increase of the size of the German Navy. I'm quickly going to share a picture of him.
Psst. Hey you ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself? Uh-oh, you live in Japan and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it, without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/The Pacific War Channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video.
So, and essentially, he starts this rearmament. He gets several laws passed in Parliament to increase the size. At first, the British more or less ignore it, and over time they get more and more worried.
I think I'm just gonna talk about, like you mentioned, these German naval laws. So similar to how the British had the Naval Defense Act of 1889, these laws kind of put more concrete numbers, I would say, in terms of the number of ships that have to be there in reserve and such. So these were a series of 4 laws passed in a broadly 15-year period. And when it did tell out the number of ships that this guy wanted, it gives you an idea of how much, how big the scale up was. So the first law, which was signed into force on 10th of April, 1898, it said there will be a flagship, 16 battleships, 8 coastal ironclads, 16 light cruisers, 13 cruiser that will be for the home fleet scouts, and 13 large cruisers that will be more of commerce traders when they talk about the foreign service, or they will be serving in the foreign colonies. So it's kind of like the cruiser squadrons that we might talk about when we get into the World War I naval battles, like Heligoland Bites at the Battle of Cornell. And there was to be a reserve of 2 battleships and 7 cruisers. So this meant by 1903 he wanted 7 existing battleships to be built, which is quite a undertaking. 2 more cruisers and 7 light cruisers. Now, these ships would be each costing well over equivalent of, 25 million pounds back then. And I think that would be putting it as a figure that I think in today's money would be closer to $500 million per ship. So you can imagine that now this is putting a strain on the economy, because as Simon alluded to earlier, the Kaiser had a very aggressive policy. Bismarck wanted to keep cordial relationships with the neighbors, not antagonize everybody. The Kaiser Wilhelm is a complete U-turn. He's like, yep, we're going to expand the army, we're going to expand the navy, we're going to expand everything, and we're going to build it up big. Now, the second Naval Act, which was signed just 2 years later, 14th of June 1900, it was massive. The fleet at the end of this building program, which was to be attained by 1920, was to include 38 battleships. 38. 14 large cruisers, 38 smaller cruisers, and 96 torpedo boats. If you were to consider the provisional increase from the first act, it's asking for 9, and including the existing fleet size, 19 new battleships and 10 new cruisers and like 96 destroyers. And when you have the 1912 Act, its final number was to be 41 battleships, 58 cruisers, 18 being the large, or you could call them the heavy cruisers, just so that we are able to distinguish them better. About 150 destroyers and 72 submarines. So it's a pretty bold plan.
It's a lot of wasted steel.
Yeah.
I'm just hearing donuts being like, "Could we not just build 300 submarines, please?"
And
yeah, we also have to keep in mind that these are all pre-dreadnoughts planned. So they already, as they start building, the first 2 laws are essentially all void because they are of the old model. And
yeah, they would not be counting any fire control long range.
And then when they all figure out you can build ships using oil fuel, they all decide to start changing
Yeah,
everything. It's actually the Russians
that's
who
actually
first do it, surprisingly.
that's actually true because right now all these ships that are laid down for construction around the time of Dreadnought's commissioning was still steam powered.
Yep.
Powerful, but still steam. And you can see why the Germans wanted to do it. So I have this comparison of at the turn of the 20th century. This was the size of each fleet. I want to keep Britain last, but amongst the countries of Germany, France, and Russia, why don't you guys just tell me which one I should just name in size first? So I'm just giving an idea of how many battleships, cruisers, and destroyers or torpedo boats they have. So France, Russia, Germany. Who do I go with first?
France.
So at the turn of the century, France had about 24 battleships, 55 cruisers of all types. So this is including the heavy and light cruisers, and about 150 destroyers and torpedo boats and a few other smaller vessels included in that 150. So a fleet size of about maybe 230 ships. And if you add much smaller minesweepers and trawlers, you can push that number up to 300 vessels. Who should we go with next?
Russia.
Maybe the Russians would
Russia.
be best, so we can have a direct comparison between the Germans and the Brits later.
Yeah. Russia, this is before the Battle of Tsushima and the Russo-Japanese War, where most of this goes to the bottom of the ocean.
They're going to take a loss, so a few losses maybe, yeah.
A few. But at the turn of the century, it was 22 battleships, 32 cruisers, and 100 destroyers and torpedo boats. And I think about 6 years later, most of it is MIA.
Yeah, it's pretty much done. They had this. They basically had to redo their entire program. Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, if we include the loss of both Arthur, wouldn't it be fair to say Russia lost pretty much almost all of its battleships, like maybe 90% of its cruisers?
Yeah, but you know what's ironic about it? At the same time, all the navies in like the following years have to face the fact that they need to either start switching over to oil-based ships, and like the Russians are the first ones to do it, so maybe
they have a clean slate.
Yeah, maybe it helped them. I don't know.
I mean,
well,
the only ships the Russians had left after the war was the ones that were stranded in the Black Sea.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the German Navy at the turn of the century, so this is, well, Tirpitz had been aggressively also pushing into a construction program, as Simon said, and he had the support of the Kaiser. So one thing we should also mention that Tirpitz also got his previous replacement of the head of the Navy replaced, because that guy was a bit more conciliatory and did not want to antagonize the British relative to what. Whereas the Kaiser and Tirpitz are like, nope, full steam ahead, literally. The German Navy had 12 battleships, 28 destroyers, and 28 cruisers, and about 100 destroyers and torpedo boat equivalents. So it's a moderately sized navy, and it's actually pretty commendable given that they've just become a nation like 3 decades ago. And I mean, yeah, granted, this is mostly the Prussian Navy. Now, if you go to Britain, this time Britain has 48 battleships. 48.
But a lot of those are
105
old,
crews.
outclassed ones too. They are keeping a lot of old ships.
True, it is. But still, the number is scary though.
Yeah.
They have 100, and just for maybe comparison purposes with the numbers I quoted of the other three navies, their total is about 58 battleships together. That's quite a. The British have 105 cruisers to 115 of the other three combined. And they have about 200 more efficient destroyers and torpedo boats, whereas the others together are around 350. So the British single-handedly have about 350 ships, not even counting like minesweepers and such. But as we saw with what Turpins got passed, now the problem is the British now have to react. Legally speaking, they have a law that's way older that says we need to be better than the next two navies combined in terms of size and capital ships. And what if Germany is building big? France is also rebuilding its like expanding its navy, which is kind of why they wanted at Scapa Flow to take the German fleet because free ships, we don't have to spend money. So Britain has to also react. Now, what ends up happening is it pushes Britain now into a political crisis, I would call it. Right now, we have Herbert Asquith, who is the Prime Minister in 1908. Now, Asquith is the guy who would be considered as leading Britain to the failures of World War One. You could say, like a lot of his critics go on that. Correct? You have a picture of Asquith up?
Here, one
Just having some
second.
issues with my Zoom.
I want to find. I forgot to label them properly. I hope I have the right picture.
He doesn't have a beard.
What a travesty.
Oh, sorry, this is him
Yep.
right here.
Yep, that's Asquith. Now, Asquith, he is first of all, he doesn't like he's a bit more of a pacifist. It's kind of like, oh, we've seen that with Neville Chamberlain as well. Now, he took a major role in passing a lot of legislation for reduction of the House of Lords. And what causes his problem is that the people and media sensationalize the German threat of the Navy. And this causes a lot of issues because now the budget has to be allocated to the upgrading of the Royal Navy and expansion.
I might just add something. Kind of the reason why you could say he was a lackluster prime minister. Before the war breaks out, he was overseeing like very radical policies. Like he introduced the National Insurance Act and stuff, and he's implementing health and unemployment insurance. Things like these are brand new, to Britain. So it was a huge overtaking. It was financially pretty radical. So it kind of put them in an awkward position when the war was coming. So that's a big problem of his. That's what happened.
Yeah, so this took place when Reginald McKenna was a British banker who was after Jackie Fisher appointed to the First Lord of the Admiralty and led to more budget being allocated. And funny enough, it was Churchill and David Lloyd George, so two very aggressive people when we would get into World War One, who are opposed to this because they want more welfare programs to be launched and continued in the country, which is one of the most ironic things I can ever think of for those. Now, ultimately, there was the crisis in Morocco, and that would be, this also, however, led him to solidify a relationship between France and Britain because they are scared of Germany, and Germany is kind of like, annoying France over the Moroccan crisis because one of the diplomatic overtures made between the two countries of France and Britain was to keep France agreed not to come into Egypt, with the British promise being that we will not interfere in Morocco. We'll keep each other's interests.
To oversimplify to the audience, basically France and Britain agreed that they would stop competing with each other in Africa just so the Germans couldn't get a peace. That was more or less what they did.
That's actually a very good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as the Germans tried to set a foot and get their own little colonies, like the French and British, were like, I think we'll put aside our like millennia of rivalry just to make sure this guy doesn't get involved. Yeah.
I mean, at some point, as I said before, you can a bit understand where the Germans are coming from and saying, we need to build up because literally everybody was antagonizing them.
Yep.
I know, but it was going to be a very costly mistake for both countries over the next few years because the scale is good. Like, I think I did some digging in and found out the number of shipyards that were being used by each country. And especially at Britain, because now they have way more expertise and scale of production than the Germans. Because not only Britain has been building ships for its own naval requirements, it's been
For everyone else.
selling it to Japan and other navies as well. I mean,
Oh.
they also handed out titles because the Kaiser Wilhelm II was also an admiral in the British Navy.
Yeah, but the one thing you have to hand it to the Germans, the Krupp company with their artillery, because they were building most of the cannons for land and sea-based units. They were selling it all over the world, and they still, and even ships. They built ships for Japan and other countries. They weren't out of the game, but if you're going to compare them to the #1 naval empire in the world, yeah, it looks kind of small.
True. I think it really just goes to show if you might think about Spain in the 1580s,
Yeah.
Britain's at a scale that far exceeds that in terms of power. Like setbacks aren't going to be a problem there, and they are by far the richest nation in the world right now.
Oh yeah, big time.
Now, I think some of the key shipyards I might just talk about, like, so let's start with the Royal Navy first, is Portsmouth Dockyard. They not only did the refits of the older vessels, because one of the things that the British and Germans were doing to especially their older battleships, was they refitted the armor and the main guns and the engines. Sometimes it could be cheaper, but most of the time such refits ended up being way more costly than building an absolutely new ship. But if you want to keep the numbers up, you got to do this. Portsmouth, which was owned by the Royal Navy, focused on battleships, cruisers, and this was like, some of the older pre-dreadnoughts such as the Lord Nelson class and HMS Dreadnought, where they were commissioned. Built out. And Portsmouth Dockyard has actually been producing ships for the British Navy for over 600 years. It still does, 15th century onwards, so it's quite an old seaport. The second is Devonport in Plymouth. Again, it focused on battleships and refits, and was also a pretty big one. And this was very important with Britain's access to the Atlantic. Then you have Chatham Dockyard. Now, this did not build any of the big capital ships. It only focused on the light cruisers and the destroyers. Then you also had Royston Dockyard in Scotland, which was pretty new. It was established only in 1909, but would see full-scale production during World War I. And it mostly focused on destroyers, but the repair of all battleships. And considering we know that the British home fleet is going to be based at Scapa Flow in Scotland, it's a pretty good base to have for them. Then you also had Vickers, Sons and Maxim in Barrow, which also focus on battleships, battlecruisers, submarines. So both countries actually not only had their own navy/government operated yards, they contracted it out to a lot of these established, private manufacturers. For example, and some of these are very good. Like, for example, you mentioned Krupp in terms of, I think, pretty much every big German gun out there is a Krupp back at that time.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't even know if there's any other company that made such big guns.
Yeah, there's two other big companies that go on to World War II. I forget the names because Krupp is just the one everyone knows. It makes most of it.
Yeah. Now, Vickers, Sons and Maxim in Barrow and Furness, they built battleships, battlecruisers, and submarines. So HMS Vanguard was one notable ship that came from this yard. Now, in Scotland, you had the John Brown and Company, which made HMS Tiger and HMS Repulse. I'm saying that's our good friend that we lost at 4Z.
Unfortunately, battleships can be hit by aircraft. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, right? Aircraft are just not going to have any effect.
Yeah.
Then you have Armstrong Whitworth. So they kind of were like more on cruisers, and they had and battle cruisers. So they also were they created HMS Invincible, which is the first battle cruiser, which is a really, in my view, a really dumb idea that the British and Japanese pursued, the battle cruiser. So folks, battle cruisers are just basically battleships that trade off armor for maybe 3-4 knots extra speed.
It's part of the Jundakel doctrine again. They thought that they would need something that could somehow compete with cruisers, but not be a cruiser. It's a weird, yeah, it was a bad idea.
I mean, the German pocket battleships that came in World War II were far better.
The pocket battleship is brilliant design. That makes sense.
I know they can outgun anything but a battleship.
Yeah.
But they can escape a battleship.
I must add, I'm biased. I play World of Warships sometimes, so like, I have like this profitity for these. But yeah.
Got it. Then you had in Glasgow Fairfield Shipbuilding, which built cruisers and destroyers. And now, if you were to compare the output, Britain at this time, in the peak of the naval arms race between 1906 to about 1912, they are producing a phenomenal 4 to 6 battleships or battle cruisers every year. That's serious firepower coming in. And you can then increase that number to put in about, one moment. This is the problem when you do so much research. You just lose where everything goes. Once. I think the number was about 12 to 14 cruisers. And obviously destroyers are much higher. And one of the things is Britain has scale and efficiency. So Germany did match Britain somewhat in scale. Like it completely outbuilt any other navy barring the British, but they could not keep up. And I think it was estimated that between 1906 to 1914, Britain produced 60% of all capital ships. Now, capital here is cruiser and above. That's generally what folks consider as the capital ships. So while Germany was focusing and producing a significant number of the dreadnoughts or the battleships, Britain also did focus quite heavily on the cruiser department. Now the Germans also had, so you had Wilhelmshaven, which was at that time the imperial shipyard, and they produced like a lot of battleships and cruisers, which was, if I'm not mistaken, the single largest shipyard of Germany, like by far, and it's able to build like similar to Portsmouth, almost 2 or 3 battleships at the same time. Then you had Kiel on the Baltic Sea. They were the people that were producing capital ships and later Germany's main potent naval weapon, submarines. And this is where actually a lot of the submarine development and testing facilities were actually kept in Kiel. Then you also
I think we may have lost Gara for a second there.
Yeah, it appears that way.
Yeah, so it must be his internet. I was like curious if it was my own. Oh, Garov, you back.
I'm able to hear you guys completely. I don't know what's going on with Zoom.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because I don't lose connection because I could hear you guys say like you can lost me with connection.
Oh, that's weird. Well, anyways, you can carry on.
Yeah, so we had Wilhelmshaven, which was the largest German shipyard. And it was at a scale that was comparable to the large Portsmouth shipyard in the sense it could handle multiple capital ships at once. Then Kiel was slightly smaller, but while it also built the capital ships, it was the proving grounds and testing grounds for all the submarines. you know, soon to be Germany's only potent naval weapon, because fleet in being was going to be the next strategy.
If only certain admirals just before World War II were listened to instead of Raider, and they just didn't build a bunch of useless ass ships. I mean, I have a friend who just
Well,
loves, the Tirpitz, and I'm like, oh yeah, the grand hunt for the Tirpitz. But I mean, like, it didn't do that much other than hide,
Yeah.
so
well, to be fair, the Tirpitz battleship did tie down a fair amount of Royal Navy forces,
yeah,
and
it's
they
true.
wasted a ton of bombs and fighters and bombers hunting it.
Yeah.
Then you had the Danzig shipyard, which was now which is now Gdansk in Poland, because that time, this was part of Imperial Germany. They kind of had support facilities for the dreadnoughts, but focused on the lighter cruisers and belows. Now, among the private naval contractors, you had Blom and Voss, which is in Hamburg. So you had SMS Dreadnought, which was a German battle cruiser. So the Germans also did use battle cruisers in World War One. It's just that why I mentioned Britain and Japan was they were also using it in World War Two. Then you had AG Vulcan, which was in Stettin in Hamburg, which was cruisers and below. And they are going to be one of the most important shipyards late in World War One, because they're going to be the primary submarine supply arm. Especially when Tirpitz during World War One is going to say, okay, guys, my grand fleet that I kept pestering you guys for 25 years, wasting a lot of money, is not going to help us. We need submarines. I mean, that's Simon. I think you can just keep me honest if that is basically what he said.
More or less. Well, no, actually, Tirpitz didn't say that. Tirpitz wanted the fleet to go out all the time, but everybody else said, like, that is stupid. We wasted so much money on them.
I'm just trying to imagine the time where the Germans become so desperate they start melting down church bells for artillery shells, and I'm just looking at those ships out and seeing being like, a lot of steel. Yeah.
I thought Tirpitz did, become a proponent and supporter of the unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. I do apologize if that is a mistake.
During the war, he actually constantly asked, like, okay, let's use our ships. Let's use our ships. And everybody else was like, well, we're just gonna lose them, and we spend so much money on them.
That's actually quite a common problem that we see with pretty much every navy.
Churchill at Gallipoli, that's what happened. The admirals didn't want to give up their old, outdated ships. So.
Oh, you mean, and not to mention the loss of 6 in 2 days of trying to go, just saying yep, we can just sail up to Constantinople and show force, and these guys are like, yep, we don't have to worry about anything whatsoever.
Just to for once give Churchill some credit, his plan was for all those ships to be destroyed. They were all really outdated pieces of shit, but the admirals really loved their old ships and they just wouldn't do it. So honestly, it was kind of on the admirals in that one.
Actually, Tirpitz, and we already talked about the Naval Law Amendment of 1912, which changed a few things. And one of the things was, well, it fixed the amount of ships that needed to produce in a year, which was updated from 3 capital ships to 4 capital battleships a year. And he actually shortened the service life of the ships so he could replace them with better, newer ships, and in this way get rid of the old, outdated ships.
Oh boy.
Greg, I just wanted to remember, you mentioned that you had shell comparison sizes.
Oh yeah, here
I think that'll be pretty cool, because I think really gives you an idea of why shell is so scary.
Unfortunately, this is kind of World War II era, because you can see the 18-inch armor piercer at the left-hand side, so that's the biggest.
Yamato.
I mean, the Super Yamato theoretically should have had 20-inch because they were batshit crazy. They thought they'd make that. But yeah, you have the 16-inch, the 14-inch is going to be much more common. 12-inch, we've seen that from Russo-Japanese War, World War One, that's used around. And then the little 8-inch at the end there. And of course, you have armor piercing, you have the heavy explosive, and there's hybrid designs too. The Japanese played with like a bunch of different stuff. I think the French used a hybrid design also, and there's every country had their own variations. But yeah, it does show like for the audience, an 18-inch shell is about as tall as a human, so it's pretty big when it
If
hits your ship.
and I think they would be like even 12-inch onwards, these shells are going to be weighing over 400 kilos each.
Oh yeah, it's a hell of
I I
armament.
remember I remember going to the Imperial War Museum when I was in London, and as you enter the compound and just walk forward, there were I think it was like a 15-inch shell. Not sure the exact caliber. It's well over 6 feet tall, one shell.
Yep.
Well,
And
at least it's not Square Gustav's shell.
I don't know. Did
Craig.
did you have a chance to
Yeah.
mention the different armaments also? Like
Yeah,
from
I was
pre-Dreadnought
actually
to yeah.
I think I wanted to actually I had this picture ready,
Yeah,
but
here, I'll stop sharing, go
uh,
for it.
yeah, one moment. So I guess this is just to give an idea of like the muzzle of the one of the main 12-inch gun turrets of the Dreadnought, and this is just like some examples of the ship. So this was the French Liberté class. So you can see it has so much firepower on its sides. It's still kind of having that broadside effect, I might add. It's uh, it's like- yep. Now, I think the main difference is these 12-inch guns, sorry, which you see here. One battery here, two at the aft, and one here, and it'll have a corresponding companion on the other side of the ship. They could fire together, they could be linked, so it gives a lot of heavy firepower warning. And the other guns are just going to be mostly for self-defense if by chance a destroyer has the guts to come pretty close to it. And I think like we also have to talk about that they had far more better sophisticated transmission capabilities, which was explained by the conning tower and the height of the masts. So I think this is just like a little bit of the Dreadnought. I think now Simon, maybe we would want to talk about how this little arms race came to an end.
Yeah, so after the Dreadnought was introduced and everybody first of all panicked, the both not only the British panicked before by direction of essentially what Germany was doing. The Germans reacted after seeing the Dreadnought and absolutely panicked, and then they first of all started with their own countership, which was the SMS
Nassau class.
Nassau, which was kind of a mix between Dreadnought and the previous ships because it had a lot of the 11-inch guns with twin towers, but it still kept some of the 6-inch guns and smaller armaments, as well as torpedoes.
I might add one thing that the Nassau, as the first, you could call the Dreadnought class equivalent for Germany, it had a better range than the Dreadnought itself, with a operational range of 15,400 kilometers. So it's about 3,000 kilometers more than Dreadnought at a comparable speed.
Yeah. So this was essentially their first attempt. And then time and time again, they introduced new classes like the Kaiser class, and similar ships.
And that
And
that feels like
later
I was just gonna say it looks like a Blackstone fortress with the rotating guns in a way, like
yeah.
365 power.
Yeah, and later we get to the point where we're not building dreadnoughts anymore, but super dreadnoughts, which are even bigger, and the dreadnoughts that had before became outdated again. So there's this constant arms race again, where new ships are created with bigger and bigger guns. And
But
all of this,
how did the sorry, yeah, continue.
all of this cost an extreme amount. And at some point, the money that was allocated for the Navy wasn't enough, because building a dreadnought is more expensive than building a pre-dreadnoughts, and the law was still from the pre-dreadnought era. So they had to update these laws, and this cost was too much for the German government, and Parliament constantly fought with the Navy over how much they would get. And this would actually be a massive issue for the Tirpitz. And
Let me just give you an idea, like just for the audience, made some quick calculations. Battleship or dreadnought back then cost £2 million, approximately in the currency then. Today, that is going to be equivalent to over 350. So put it at like $500 million per ship, like, just taking broad calculative estimates. So you can imagine this is, and on top of that, one thing we need to also consider, it's one thing to build the ship, but there's going to be maintenance, it's going to be running costs, and they pile up a lot.
yeah.
And this has been an actual problem throughout naval history. I actually remember that during the Greco-Persian Wars, right? So Athens was always famous for its navy. It was way cheaper to just build a ship and lose it in battle than to keep the ship afloat and let it sit for 10 years, because the amount of money that you have to pay for, like, the crew and running it, most people hated it.
But unfortunately, Kaiser Wilhelm II was, like most of the great leaders, very influenced by the Mahan Doctrine. So he fell into, that old habit. You build your capital ships and you just sit on them, and they achieve your diplomacy by just existing.
I think what also
that-
oftentimes is a bit underestimated is, because the German country is so young, people don't know what Germany is, and they don't really care for it. So this is also a massive prestige project to essentially just go to the people and tell them, see, we couldn't have built all the ships if we weren't united. Isn't it great being German? And we are all German, despite none of us knowing what that actually means.
Yeah. We haven't
Actually,
even
a good-
mentioned this at all, but the United States under Teddy Roosevelt, he had the Great White Fleet Tour to try and
yeah.
show, the United States was there too, and they're on the stage, and that had influence on like the Kaiser as well. This nation that was kind of considered not one of the big boys, kind of showed up, and yeah, Germany obviously was influenced by that. They wanted to also have a navy. I mean, it had influence.
I completely skipped my mind in my research. I was remembering the Great White Fleet suddenly, because it was just like a big tour.
Yep. And it was to scare Japan. Teddy Roosevelt, as much as he was kind of a Japanophile, people would say, as soon as the treaty was signed at Portsmouth, he was like, they're a problem. We need to do stuff. So yeah.
Well, it was his diplomacy that really pissed off the Japanese after the war. So.
There's many reasons as to why Japan would kind of go to World War II the way it did, and they felt he cheated them out of victory. And it was, a reoccurring thing with them. they had been cheated by the Triple Alliance of Germany, France, and Russia in the first Sino-Japanese War when they stole their shit. Russo-Japanese War, Japan's like, oh, well, we won, didn't we? And no, like neither side actually won that, mind you. But yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, the Japanese approached Teddy because they're like, this guy clearly loves us. He's the only guy who talks about us positively. So when he did that, yeah, that didn't go so well. And then he kind of started the whole war plan orange thing to build plans to go to war with Japan. And it's not like Japan didn't know. So yeah, it's not good. Not a good look.
Well, I think I'll just say, if they wanted someone who actually spoke to them pretty well or thought of them quite respectfully, they could have approached King Edward VII. He actually did not, like, have any racial disdain for the Japanese. So I think when it was said in 1904, when Wilhelm and Edward met in an Anglo-German summit, Wilhelm, with the Russo-Japanese War in mind, said he talks about the yellow peril, which
Which
says,
is Kaiser
the
Wilhelm
greatest
II's
peril.
entire fault. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he goes on that rant, right, which is how he's convinced Tsar Nicholas to go to war, right?
Yeah.
Edward stated that he could not see it, that the Japanese were an intelligent, brave, and chivalrous nation, quite civilized as the Europeans, from whom they only differed by the pigmentation of the skin.
But just, I mean, it's such a rabbit hole to go down. I would just reiterate to the audience, as many people like to paint Kaiser Wilhelm II as like this racist lunatic, he was doing this yellow peril thing for another reason. He was trying to destroy the diplomatic relations between like France and then England with Russia and all that. And he was basically just trying to achieve what Otto von Bismarck was slowly doing, the German dominance by just, divide and conquer.
He just did not understand, like, subtle planning and the long-term vision.
He was an idiot.
And just to add to that, it was more like he convinced Tsar Nicholas that the Japanese are the threat. He needs to fight against the yellow peril.
Yeah.
Because he's inherently no more racist than anyone else at that time.
Yeah.
And his main goal of that was he hoped that with Russia dominating the war against Japan, especially on the land, that was the hope, that the British and Japanese alliance would obligate the British to come to Japan's aid.
Mm-hmm.
And if Britain did that, then he would have the pretext that he could somehow justify that he can now come onto Russia's side.
With France.
Because
France was allied to Russia and financially tied to them. So he thought it was a sneaky way to get a triple alliance, basically, which they already kind of had.
Yeah.
And what also oftentimes is forgotten is that he was a very insecure man. It is well known that he had a birth defect that left his arm limb. So oftentimes when you see pictures of him, like in public, you oftentimes see his arm on a saber. That is to hide his birth defect.
Yeah.
Of his
arm. Something Stalin also did about his arm, right? Stalin had like something about his arm that he kept it hidden.
But could he cut his own food?
No, it wasn't. It was fully functional, but it was just a bit longer. It was a bit weaker, and so it was not as noticeable. But for him, it was a affront to his honor, essentially.
Yeah.
And he actually blamed the doctors that gave birth to him, which were British, and also is the reason why he hated the Brits so much.
Oh, I never knew that. Oh my god.
I think the war, you could just say that the naval arms race ends because of, I guess, German Chancellor Theobald von Bettam Hollweg, because he wants to put a peace with Britain, because he and now the German military are starting to realize that Britain may not be as much of our main enemy right now as Russia is going to be, because Russia, as we said, right, they got a pretty big licking across both the army and navy in the Russo-Japanese War, so they're building up from scratch again. Though I don't think they really took a lot of the lessons that they learned. That's a different thing. But
Yeah,
they're rearming and rebuilding their armed forces quite rapidly. And that actually, I think now even the Kaiser is wanting to now focus. I think he's had enough of his naval toys. And he wants to divert funding to the army now. Germany is not as big of a nation, so they don't have as much economy, they don't have as much of resources to keep up the scale of production for both armed services.
yeah.
And much to Tirpitz's disdain, he kind of stifles off the funding to go to the army and reaches a piece of like a kind of peace, right? Which is like the Haldane mission.
More or less. So he goes to Britain to negotiate, and the first proposal is like the British fleet is gonna be double the size of the German fleet, and Tirpitz is completely outraged, and he keeps on sabotaging every negotiation. So in the end, everybody is so annoyed of him, and they only sort of come to agreement, and there's no official treaty.
Yeah, it was like a agreement, like you could put like a gentleman's agreement because there's no obligation to really be bound by it. But it ended the arms race for now. But by the time the arms race ends, it just gives them, you could say, 1.5 years of respite, because we know what's going to happen in Sarajevo
Yeah.
in 1914. But I think what we should also now consider is at the start of World War I, the size of the fleets that are there. Right, so the Russian Navy has only 4 dreadnoughts, 54,000 people. France has 68,000 people and 10 dreadnoughts. And together, these guys are like 1 million tons of tonnage across all shipping. I don't know if I really should count Austria, just because, they don't really, I don't know if they really had a effective navy. But the Austrians had.
Well, you know
3
what? In the
dreadnoughts.
Mediterranean, the Austro-Hungarian submarine force was so annoying, the British did have to ask the Japanese to come help.
Oh, really?
The Japanese who didn't have a submarine, nor any idea how to combat them.
But the Austrian-Hungarians at the start of World War I, they have 3 dreadnoughts and 1 under construction, 16,000 persons, and the total tonnage is 250,000. And now, the Germans have a navy of just under 80,000 men, 17 dreadnoughts, thanks to their arms race. So this is not even including the pre-dreadnoughts. And a total tonnage of about 1 million tons. So they are now a navy that is larger than the Russian and French navies combined, if we take tonnage as our barometer. But the Royal Navy still reigns supreme, because at the start of World War I, you're talking about 29 dreadnoughts, 209,000 persons available in the Royal Navy, and a total tonnage of 2.2 million tons. Oh, and let's also not even getting in the size of the British merchant fleets.
Which, to be honest, that's a lot of tons that a U-boat can just send right to the bottom if
they're not being hunted themselves.
Yeah.
And if they didn't have spent all the money on, the big ship instead of the U-boats.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what's the fun of breaking a champagne bottle and inaugurating the launch of a U-boat when you can do it at a 50,000 ton battleship?
But people forget people are fascinated by the U-boat and the warfare in World War II. But in World War I, the German U-boat campaign almost was successful.
They actually, I think it's the German U-boat campaign, especially with unrestricted submarine warfare. They could have actually brought Britain to its knees. Well, even if they violated after they violated the US neutrality and just continued. Because keep in mind, US declares war on Germany after incessant submarine attacks in April 1917, and it's not till the 100 Days Offensive, which is 16 months later, if my maths is correct, approximately,
Yeah.
when the American forces are in Europe in sufficient strength, taking up positions on the battle lines and able to attack in force.
Well,
It
they
does
were
not.
freeing up the guys who knew how to fight. Like the Americans showed up, got shot at, and they're like, "Oh shit."
I know that the funny thing, but that's a different topic.
Yeah.
It's definitely like, we are definitely going to do a World War One series just in the future.
Okay.
But I think this sets up our naval arms race and was one of the cause issues that led to the buildup of war, because
Yeah.
World War One was inevitable.
Yeah.
All these guys, for like the last few years, all the countries in their alliances or whatnot with their goals, they just needed one spark to just, push them to war.
Yeah.
They just needed the excuse.
And they were all looking for a 6-month war. No one could conceive a global war the way it unfolded.
Yeah, it was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914, right?
Yeah. The Japanese high command, because the British when they declared war on Germany, the British were like, "Hey, Japan, could you just, for no apparent reason, we're not going to give you anything, help us by hunting the Germans in the Pacific?" And the Japanese were like, this thing in Europe, it's going to be like 6 months. What can we really get out of it in that time? This is not worth our time. But they did join eventually.
But yeah, I think that is our German arms race.
I actually have one anecdote
Yeah.
I would like to tell.
Sure.
Kind of a bit of a funny story. So there is this thing in Germany. So to finance all of this, or to help finances, the emperor created a new tax, which was the Schaumweinsteuer, the foam wine tax, which is like a tax on champagne and similar beverages.
Damn.
And
There goes the alcohol.
yeah, and the funny thing is, this tax exists to this day.
Yep.
It is still we still pay taxes because the emperor wanted a bigger ship.
I'll just say this. At least we don't have the urine tax of Vespasian anymore.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say that. Like, there have been worse taxes than this alcohol tax of the Kaiser.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. This is one of the more fun episodes, to be honest, and it's one that we all got to engage in, which was a lot of fun. But I want to say to the audience before we let you go, if you'd like to further support the channel, please consider joining the YouTube membership or my Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/Pacific War Channel. Over there, you get access to the exclusive podcast series. You get early access to all the content I make, which there's a few episodes actually sitting on the Patreon right now. And you get some voting rights for subjects I'm going to tackle next. Again, thank you, Gaurav and Simon. This has been a lot of fun. Until next time.
And I'm gonna just leave this for the audience. The next 2 episodes we are doing together, Battle of Jutland.
It's going to be a long one.